The Pearl, Chapter 6, Part 2. When we left off, Kino had just said, "We will go into the mountains. Maybe we can lose them in the mountains." So frantically meaning just in a hurry, lots of worry. Frantically, he gathered the gourds and the little bags that were their property. Remember, gourds are containers that are made of squash. Kino carried a bundle in his left hand, but the big knife swung free in his right hand. He parted the brush for Juana and they hurried to the west, towards the high stone mountains. They trotted quickly through the tangle of the undergrowth. This was panic flight. Kino did not try to conceal or hide his passage. He trotted, kicking the stones, knocking the telltale leaves, the ones that would tell kind of where they went, from the little trees. The high sun streamed down on the dry, creaking earth, so that even the vegetation ticked or made little sound in protest. But ahead were the naked granite, which is a type of rock, the naked granite mountains rising out of erosion rubble and standing monolithic, almost as if they were a building against the sky. And Kino ran for the high place, as nearly all animals do when they are pursued. So we have, again, a little characterization of Kino. He's being characterized as an animal. Again, he's being tracked by hunters. He is running for the high ground like an animal. He is no longer fully human. How did he get that way? The land was waterless, furred with the cacti which could store water, and with the great rooted brush which could reach deep into the earth for a little moisture and get along on very little. And underfoot was not soil or regular dirt, but broken rock, split into small cubes, great slabs, but none of it water-rounded. So they're in the desert. Little tufts of sad, dry grass grew between the stones, grass that had sprouted with one single rain and headed, dropped its seed, and died. Horned toads watched the family go by and turned their little pivoting dragon heads. And now and then a great jackrabbit, disturbed in his shade, bumped away and hid behind the nearest rock. The singing heat, I think that's the singeing, almost like a singe that you would get on a hot pan if you touched it. The singeing heat lay over this desert country, and ahead the stone mountains looked cool and welcoming. And Kino fled. He ran. He knew what would happen. A little way along the road, the trackers would become aware that they had missed the path, and they would come back, searching and judging. In a little while, they would find the place where Kino and Juana had rested. From there, it would be easy for them. Those little stones, the fallen leaves and the whipped branches, the scuffed places where a foot had slipped, Kino could see them in his mind, slipping along the track, whining a little with eagerness, and behind them, dark and half interested, the horseman with his rifle. His work would come last, for he would not take them back. Who's not coming back? I don't know. Let's find out. Oh, the music of evil sang loud in Kino's head now. It sang with the whine of heat and with the dry ringing of snake rattles. It was not large and overwhelming now, but secret and poisonous, and the pounding of his heart gave it undertone and rhythm. All he hears is the music of evil and his own heart. The way began to rise, and as it did, the rocks grew larger. But now Kino had put a little distance between his family and the trackers. Now on the first rise, on the first kind of flat area of the hill, he rested. He climbed a great boulder, a great enormous rock, and looked back over the shimmering country. But he could not see his enemies, not even the tall horseman riding through the brush. Juana had squatted in the shade of the boulder. She raised her bottle of water to Coyotito's lips. His little dried tongue sucked greedily at it. She looked up at Kino when he came back. She saw him examine her ankles, cut and scratched from the stones and brush, and she covered them quickly with her skirt. How do you think Kino's feeling right now about Juana with the little cuts on her leg? And how's Juana feeling about him looking at those cuts on her leg? I suspect that Kino's maybe a little worried, and Juana's trying to take that worry away from him. Where were we? Then she handed the bottle to him, but he shook his head. Her eyes were bright in her tired face. Kino moistened his cracked lips with his tongue. Yo, they're in the desert. What's going to happen to Kino if he doesn't drink? He's already got cracked lips. They're dry. What's going to happen to him? Juana, he said, I will go on and you will hide. I will lead them into the mountains, and when they have gone past, you will go north to Loretta or to Santa Rosalia. Then, if I can escape them, I will come to you. It is the only safe way. She looked full into his eyes for a moment. This woman, the one who let him beat her and still came up to him. No, she said. We go with you. I can go faster alone, he said harshly. You will put the little one in more danger if you go with me. No, said Juana. You must. It is the wise thing, and it is my wish, he said. No, said Juana. He looked then for weakness in her face, for fear or irresolution or some evidence that she's not completely decided on this. And there was none. There's no evidence of that. Her eyes were very bright. He shrugged his shoulders helplessly then, but he had taken strength from her. Her bravery made him feel brave. When they moved on, it was no longer panic flight. They weren't fleeing, flying away, right? Metaphorically flying, not literally flying. In panic. Now he's got some strength. The country, as it rose toward the mountains, changed rapidly. Now there were long outcroppings of granite, so like spaces where some of the mountain kind of sticks out, it crops out, with deep crevices or big gaps between. And Kino walked on bare, unmarkable stone when he could, and leaped from ledge to ledge. He knew that wherever the trackers lost his path, they must circle and lose time before they found it again. And so he did not go straight for the mountains anymore. He moved in zigzags, kind of back and forth like Z's. And sometimes he cut back to the south and left a sign, and then went toward the mountains over bare stone again. So he's trying to trick them. He's kind of going back over his own path and taking a weird turn, and then finding a place where there's no footprints to make, and coming back up. And the path rose steeply now, so that he panted like a dog a little as he went. The sun moved downward toward the bare stone teeth of the mountains, and Kino set his direction for a dark and shadowy cleft or open space in the range. If there were any water at all, it would be there where he could see, even in the distance, a hint of foliage. Foliage is a word to say like green growing things, like leaves. And if there were any passage through the smooth stone range, the mountain range, it would be in the same deep cleft. It had its danger, for the trackers would think of it too, but the empty water bottle did not let that consideration enter. And as the sun lowered, Kino and Juana struggled wearily with tiredness up the steep slope towards the cleft. High in the gray stone mountains under a frowning peak, a little spring, a little natural flow of water bubbled out of a rupture or break in the stone. It was fed by shade-preserved snow in the summer, and now and then it dried completely, and bare rocks and dry algae, or like the green moss stuff, were on its bottom. But nearly always it gushed out clean and cold and lovely. So this is great. This is a little spring where they can get some water. In the times when the quick rains fell, so when it rains like hard and fast, you know how it sometimes just like dumps 2 inches of rain on us and we're like, where did that come from? And then there's flooding. Same thing. It might become a freshet or a very small river and send its column of white water crashing down the mountain cleft. But nearly always it was a lean or a little small little spring. It bubbled out into a pool and then fell 100 feet to another pool, and this one, overflowing, dropped again, so that it continued down and down until it came to the rubble of the upland, and there it disappeared altogether. This sounds very beautiful, doesn't it? It's like a little waterfall in the mountains. There wasn't much left of it then anyway, for every time it fell over an escarpment, the thirsty air drank it. So every time it fell over kind of an edge and became like a little waterfall, it evaporated a lot. And it splashed from the pools to the dry vegetation, the dry plants. The animals for miles around came to drink from the little pools, and the wild sheep and the deer, the pumas or mountain lions and raccoons and the mice all came to drink. And the birds, which spent the day in the brushland, came at night to the little pools that were like steps in the mountain cleft. Beside this tiny stream, wherever enough earth collected for roothold, colonies of plants grew. Wild grape and little palms, maidenhair fern, hibiscus, which are big red flowers, and tall pampas grass with feathery rods raised above the spike leaves. And in the pool lived frogs and water skaters, which are large, weird-looking bugs, and water worms crawled on the bottom of the pool. Everything that loved water came to these few, shallow, not very deep places. The cats took their prey there they hunted, and strewed feathers and lapped water through their bloody teeth. The little pools were places of life because of the water, and places of killing because of the water too. And again, think of the symbolism. They're going to this water because they have to, otherwise they'll die of dehydration. But that's also where the trackers are going to go because they will know that Kino and Juana need water. The lowest step where the stream collected before it tumbled down 100 feet and disappeared into the rubbly desert was a little platform of stone and sand. Only a tiny thin trickle of water fell into the pool, but it was enough to keep the pool full and to keep the ferns, which are little plants, green in the underhang of the cliff, and wild grape climbed the stone mountain, and all manner of little plants found comfort here. The freshets, the little tiny rivers that sometimes spring up, had made a small sandy beach through which the pool flowed, and bright green watercress, another plant, grew in the damp sand. The beach was cut and scarred and padded by the feet of animals that had come to drink and to hunt. The sun had passed over the stone mountains when Kino and Juana struggled up the steep broken slope and came at last to the water. From this step they could look out over the sun-beaten desert to the blue gulf in the distance. They came utterly, completely weary, exhausted to the pool, and Juana slumped to her knees and first washed Coyotito's face and then filled her bottle and gave him a drink. And the baby was weary or tired and petulant. He was kind of cranky or a little upset. And he cried softly until Juana gave him her breast, and then he gurgled and clucked against her. He made little baby noises. Kino drank long and thirstily at the pool. For a moment then he stretched out beside the water and relaxed all his muscles and watched Juana feeding the baby. And then he got to his feet and went to the edge of the step where the water slipped over, and he searched the distance carefully. His eyes set on a point and he became rigid. He became stiff. His body became very still. Far down the slope, he could see the two trackers. They were little more than dots or scurrying ants, and behind them a larger ant. Juana had turned to look at him, and she saw his back stiffen. "How far?" she asked quietly. "They will be here by evening," said Kino. He looked up the long, steep chimney of the cleft where the water came down. "We must go west," he said, and his eyes searched the stone shoulder behind the cleft. And 30 feet up on the gray shoulder, he saw a series of little erosion caves, like little spaces carved out over time by rain and wind. He slipped off his sandals and clambered up to them, kind of climbing clumsily, gripping the bare stone with his toes, and he looked into the shallow caves. They were only a few feet deep, wind-hollowed scoops, but they sloped slightly downward and back. Kino crawled into the largest one and lay down, and knew that he could not be seen from the outside. Quickly he went back to Juana. "You must go up there. Perhaps they will not find us there," he said. Without question, she filled her water bottle to the top, and then Kino helped her up to the shallow cave and brought up the packages of food and passed them to her. And Juana sat in the cave entrance and watched him. She saw that he did not try to erase their tracks in the sand. Instead, he climbed up the brush cliff beside the water, clawing and tearing at the ferns and wild grape as he went. Do you think he's doing that on purpose? Maybe he's trying to leave clues to distract the trackers again? And when he had climbed 100 feet to the next bench, he came down again. He looked carefully at the smooth rock shoulder toward the cave to see that there was no trace, no little evidence of passage. And last he climbed up and crept into the cave beside Juana. "When they go up," he said, "we will slip away, down to the lowlands again. I am afraid only that the baby may cry. You must see that he does not cry." "He will not cry," she said, and she raised the baby's face to her own and looked into her eyes, and he stared solemnly, seriously back at her. "He knows," said Juana. Now Kino lay in the cave entrance, his chin braced on his crossed arms, So he's laying like maybe on his tummy and kind of relaxing a little bit maybe. And he watched the blue shadow of the mountain move out across the brushy desert below until it reached the gulf, and the long twilight of the shadow was over the land. The trackers were long in coming, as though they had trouble with the trail Kino had left. It was dusk, or almost sunset, when they came at last to the little pool, and all three were on foot now, for a horse could not climb the last steep slope. From above, they were thin figures in the evening. The two trackers scurried about on the little beach, and they saw Kino's progress up the cliff before they drank. The man with the rifle sat down and rested himself, and the trackers squatted near him. And in the evening, the points of their cigarettes glowed and receded, glowed and kind of faded back. And then Kino could see that they were eating, and the soft murmur, the soft sound of their voices came to him. The darkness fell deep and black in the mountain cleft. The animals that used the pool came near and smelled men there and drifted away again into the darkness. He heard a murmur behind him. Juana was whispering, "Coyotito." She was begging him to be quiet. Kino heard the baby whimper, and he knew from the muffled sounds that Juana had covered his head with her shawl. Down on the beach, a match flared, and in its momentary light, Kino saw that two of the men were sleeping, curled up like dogs, while the third watched, and he saw the glint of the rifle in the match light. And then the match died, and it left a picture on Kino's eyes. He could see it just how each man was, two sleeping curled up, and the third squatting in the sand with the rifle between his knees. Kino moved silently back into the cave. Juana's eyes were two sparks reflecting a low star. Kino crawled quietly close to her and put his lips near to her cheek. "There is a way," he said, "but they will kill you." "If I get first to the one with the rifle," Kino said, "I must get to him first. Then I will be all right. Two are sleeping." Her hand crept out from under her shawl and gripped his arm. "They will see your white clothes in the starlight." "No," he said, "and I must go before moonrise." He's trying to keep it dark so that he's more hidden, right? He searched for a soft word and then gave it up, right? He's trying to say something nice in case he dies, right? "If they kill me," he said, "lie quietly, and when they are gone away, go to Loreto." Her hand shook a little, holding his wrist. "There is no choice," he said. "That is the only way. They will find us in the morning." Her voice trembled a little. "Go with God," she said. He peered closely at her, and he could see her large eyes. His hand fumbled out and found the baby, and for a moment his palm lay on Coyotito's head. And then Kino raised his hand and touched Juana's cheek, and she held her breath. How is Kino feeling right now? How is Juana feeling? Think about that before we proceed. Against the sky in the cave entrance, Juana could see that Kino was taking off his white clothes. For dirty and ragged though they were, they would show up against the dark night. His own brown skin was a better protection for him. And then she saw how he hooked his amulet neck string about the horn handle of his great knife. So he put his knife like on like his necklace, so that it hung down in front of him and left both hands free. He did not come back to her. For a moment his body was black in the cave entrance, crouched and silent, and then he was gone. It may be worth comparing his body going black in the cave entrance to all the dark figures we've seen. All the attackers have been dark silhouette figures. Juana, when she was about to throw away the pearl, was just a dark figure in the doorway. There's a lot of darkness here. Juana moved to the entrance and looked out. She peered like an owl from the hole in the mountain, and the baby slept under the blanket on her back, his face turned sideways against her neck and shoulder. She could feel his warm breath against her skin, and Juana whispered her combination of prayer and magic, her Hail Marys and her ancient intercession, her ancient sort of prayer that would get in the way against the black, unhuman things. Do you think? Who's included in that black, unhuman thing? Is it just evil spirits? Or maybe more? The night seemed a little less dark when she looked out, and to the east there was a lightening in the sky, down near the horizon where the moon would show, and looking down, she could see the cigarette of the man on watch. Kino edged like a slow lizard down the smooth rock shoulder. He had turned his neck string so that the great knife hung down from his back and could not clash against the stone. His spread fingers gripped the mountain, and his bare toes found support through contact, and even his chest lay against the stone so that he would not slip. For any sound, a rolling pebble or a sigh, a little slip of flesh on rock, would rouse or kind of alert the watchers below. Any sound that was not germane, didn't belong to the night, would make them alert. But the night was not silent. The little tree frogs that lived near the stream twittered like birds, and the high metallic ringing of the cicadas, which are, they sound a little bit like crickets, filled the mountain cleft. And Kino's own music was in his head. Now, the other things, they're external to Kino, so the trackers and the horsemen can probably hear them. Kino's own music, only in his head. Thinking perspective here, point of view. Kino's got some songs playing. This is the music of the enemy, low and pulsing, nearly asleep. But the song of the family had become as fierce and sharp and feline, almost like a cat, as the snarl of a female puma. So a puma, again, is a mountain lion. So the song of the family is becoming like a predator. And the song of the enemy is pulling back a little. The family song was alive now and driving him down on the dark enemy. The harsh cicada, the cricket sound, seemed to take up its melody, and the twittering tree frogs called little phrases of it. And Kino crept silently as a shadow down the smooth mountain face. One bare foot moved a few inches, and the toes touched the stone and gripped, and the other foot a few inches, and then the palm of one hand a little downwards, and then the other hand until the whole body, without seeming to move, had moved. Kino's mouth was open so that even his breath would make no sound, for he knew that he was not invisible. If the watcher, sensing movement, looked at the dark place against the stone which was his body, he could see him. Kino must move so slowly he would not draw the watcher's eyes. This is reminding me of the scene in The Telltale Heart when the narrator is sneaking into his landlord's room. If you are not familiar with that story, strongly recommend it. Super creepy. Totally a guy sneaking around. Where were we? Kino must move so slowly he would not draw the watcher's eyes. It took him a long time to reach the bottom and to crouch behind a little dwarf palm, so a short palm tree. His heart thundered in his chest, and his hands and face were wet with sweat, even though in the desert it's really cold at night. So he must be sweating from nervousness and exercise. He crouched and took great, slow, long breaths to calm himself. Only 20 feet separated him from the enemy now, and he tried to remember the ground between them. Was there any stone which might trip him in his rush? He kneaded his legs against cramp, so he's kind of like rubbing out a cramp in his leg, and found that his muscles were jerking after their long tension. He's kind of getting like Charlie horses or muscle spasms because he's been like working out so much, trying to creep along the cliff. And then he looked apprehensively to the east. He's worried looking at the east. The moon would rise in a few moments now, and he must attack before it rose. He could see the outline of the watcher, but the sleeping men were below his vision. It was the watcher Kino must find quickly and without hesitation. He can't pause at all. He's gotta get that guy right away. Silently, he drew the amulet string over his shoulder, so he's pulling the necklace over his shoulder, and loosened the loop from the horn handle of his great knife. He was too late, for as he rose from his crouch, the silver edge of the moon slipped above the eastern horizon, and Kino sank back behind his bush. Now, it seems silly that the moon would chase him away, and that's because we live in the city. When you go out into the country where there's no light, you can read by moonlight. Pitch dark, total nightness. You can read by the moonlight without struggling. this would be like turning on a flashlight almost. So he's going to be totally visible now. It was an old and ragged moon, so it's not a full moon, but it threw hard light and hard shadow into the mountain cleft. And now Kino could see the seated figure of the Watcher on the little beach beside the pool. The Watcher gazed full at the moon, and then he lighted another cigarette, and the match illumined his face for a moment. There could be no waiting now. When the Watcher turned his head, Kino must leap. His legs were as tight as wound springs. And then from above came a little murmuring cry. Oh no, what is it? The Watcher turned his head to listen, and then he stood up, and one of the sleepers stirred or moved around on the ground and awakened and asked quietly, What is it? I don't know, said the Watcher. It sounded like a cry, almost like a human, like a baby. The man who had been sleeping said, You can't tell. Some coyote bitch with a litter, meaning a female coyote, with a litter of pups, so babies. I've heard a coyote pup cry like a baby. The sweat rolled in drops down Kino's forehead and fell into his eyes and burned them. The little cry came again, and the Watcher looked up the side of the hill to the dark cave. Coyote, maybe, he said, and Kino heard the harsh click as he cocked the rifle. If he's getting ready to shoot. If it's a coyote, this'll stop it, the Watcher said as he raised a gun. You guys, it's not a coyote. It's the murmur was Coyotito. What's gonna happen? Oh my goodness, I'm feeling a lot of suspense right now. Kino was in mid-leap when the gun crashed and the barrel flash made a picture on his eyes. The great knife swung and crunched hollowly. It bit through neck and deep into chest, and Kino was a terrible machine now. He grasped the rifle even as he wrenched free his knife. His strength and his movement and his speed were a machine. So, wow, he switched from being an animal to now a machine, but definitely not a person. He whirled and struck the head of the seated man like a melon. Yikes. The third man scrabbled away like a crab, slipped into the pool, and then he began to climb frantically to climb up the cliff where the water penciled down. His hands and feet threshed in the tangle of the wild grapevine. He whimpered and gibbered as he tried to get up. But Kino had become as cold and deadly as steel. Deliberately, he threw the lever of the rifle, and then he raised the gun and aimed deliberately and fired. He saw his enemy tumble backward into the pool. Kino strode to the water. In the moonlight, he could see the frantic eyes. Kino aimed and fired between the eyes. And then Kino stood uncertainly. Something was wrong. Some signal was trying to get through to his brain. Tree frogs and cicadas were silent now. And then Kino's brain cleared from its red concentration, and he knew the sound. The keening, moaning, rising, hysterical cry from the little cave in the side of the stone mountain. The cry of death. Oh my God, who died? Did one of the trackers get to Juana? Or did something else happen? Well, let's check. So let's see. So Kino gets the man with the gun, and he stabs him, and he grabbed the rifle, and then he whirled and struck the head of the seated man like a melon. And then the third man is the one who climbs up, and Kino shoots him. So I think Kino's killed all three of these guys. So who's dead? And who's crying? Everyone in La Paz remembers the return of the family. There may be some old ones who saw it, but those whose fathers and whose grandfathers told it to them remember it nevertheless. It is an event that happened to everyone. It was late in the golden afternoon when the first little boys ran hysterically in the town and spread the word that Kino and Juana were coming back, and everyone hurried to see them. The sun was settling toward the western mountains, and the shadows on the ground were long. And perhaps that was what left the deep impression on those who saw them. The two came from the rutted country road into the city, and they were not walking in single file. They weren't one behind the other, Kino ahead and Juana behind as usual. They were walking side by side. The sun was behind them, and their long shadows stalked ahead, and they seemed to carry two towers of darkness with them. Kino had a rifle across his arm, and Juana carried her shawl like a sack over her shoulder, and in it was a small, limp, heavy bundle. The shawl was crusted with dried blood, and the bundle swayed a little as she walked. Her face was hard and lined and leathery with fatigue, with tiredness, and with the tightness with which she fought fatigue. And her wide eyes stared inward on herself. She was as remote and as removed as heaven. It was almost like she wasn't there. Kino's lips were thin and his jaws tight, and the people say that he carried fear with him, that he was as dangerous as a rising storm. The people say that the two seemed to be removed from human experience, that they had gone through pain and had come out on the other side, that there was almost a magical protection about them, and those people who had rushed to see them crowded back and let them pass and did not speak to them. Kino and Juana walked through the city as though it were not there. Their eyes glanced neither right nor left nor up nor down, but stared only straight ahead. Their legs moved a little jerkily, not smoothly, but like in fits and starts, like well-made wooden dolls. And they carried pillars of black fear about them. And as they walked through the stone and plaster city, brokers or dealers, right, like the pearl buyers, peered at them from barred windows, and servants put one eye to a slitted gate, and mothers turned the faces of their youngest children inward against their skirts so that they wouldn't see Kino and Juana. That's how scary Kino and Juana are right now. Kino and Juana strode side by side through the stone and plaster city and down among the brush houses, and the neighbors stood back and let them pass. Juan Tomas raised his hand in greeting and did not say the greeting and left his hand in the air for a moment uncertainly. In Kino's ears, the song of the family was as fierce as a cry. He was immune, he was untouchable and terrible, and his song had become a battle cry. They trudged past the burned square where their house had been without even looking at it. They cleared the brush that edged the beach and picked their way down the shore toward the water. And they did not look toward Kino's broken canoe. Nothing is distracting them, nothing of the past. And when they came to the water's edge, they stopped and stared out over the gulf. Now pause here and think. Think, what are they going to do? And then Kino laid the rifle down and he dug among his clothes, and then he held the great pearl in his hand. He looked into its surface, and it was gray and ulcerous. It had like kind of spots on it. Evil faces. So it wasn't like round and smooth and perfect. It was gray and like maybe bumpy even. Evil faces peered from it into his eyes, and he saw the light of burning. And in the surface of the pearl, he saw the frantic eyes of the man in the pool. And in the surface of the pearl, he saw Coyotito lying in the little cave with the top of his head shot away. And the pearl was ugly. It was gray, like a malignant growth, like a cancer tumor. Kino heard the music of the pearl, distorted and insane. Kino's hand shook a little, and he turned slowly to Juana and held the pearl out to her. She stood beside him, still holding her dead bundle over her shoulder. She looked at the pearl in his hand for a moment, and then she looked into Kino's eyes and said softly, "No, you." Whoa, 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 whoa. So this is a moment. What's in the bundle, first of all? How did it happen? And what is Kino about to do? And Kino drew back his arm and flung the pearl with all his might. Kino and Juana watched it go, winking and glimmering under the setting sun. They saw the little splash in the distance, and they stood side by side, watching the place for a long time. And the pearl settled into the lovely green water and dropped toward the bottom. The waving branches of the algae, the underwater plants, called to it and beckoned to it. The lights on its surface were green and lovely. It settled down to the sand bottom among the fern-like plants. Above the surface of the water was a green mirror, and the pearl lay on the floor of the sea. A crab scampering over the bottom raised a little cloud of sand, and when it settled, the pearl was gone. And the music of the pearl drifted to a whisper and disappeared.